The pen was in his hand when they came through the door. He was mid-sentence writing in the ledger the way he always wrote, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who understood that every number carried a human being behind it. The hall was warm. Afternoon light pressed through the tall windows of New Bethel AME Church in long, honey-colored columns, catching the dust suspended above the folding tables where 14 families sat in quiet rows. A child was coloring on a paper bag at the far end of the third row, her small hand moving in slow circles across the brown paper. Someone's phone buzzed once against a metal chair leg and then went still. The air smelled of old wood and the faint sweetness of the lemon pound cake Sister Vivian always left on the side table before taking her seat, the same cake from the same recipe every meeting for 19 years, because some rituals earned their permanence not through announcement but through repetition. The Cornerstone Community Trust had been meeting in this hall for 19 years. The ledger on the table in front of him was the 8th one, each predecessor stored in a fire-safe box in the church office. Each page photographed and archived, not because the law required it, but because he had always believed that a community's financial record should be as permanent as stone. 341 families since the beginning. 0 defaults, 0 complaints. 12 active emergency disbursements currently in process, medical debt, eviction notices, job loss, the ordinary catastrophes that arrived without warning and destroyed with precision. Each case reviewed by the board before every disbursement. Each disbursement countersigned by 2 deacons. Each family treated not as a recipient of charity, but as a member of a covenant. He had written the word covenant himself into the trust's founding charter 19 years ago at the age of 44. 3 months after leaving the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division after 14 years and a retirement at grade 15. He had chosen the word deliberately because the word transaction implied exchange, and what this trust was built on was not exchange. It was commitment. The members contributed monthly, knowing the money might never come back to them, knowing they were building a floor for each other rather than a ladder for themselves. That was the thing nobody on the outside ever quite understood. Not the lawyers who reviewed the charter, not the state grant officers who audited the compliance reports, and certainly not anyone who had received an anonymous tip about it through a non-emergency line. Sister Vivian Marsh was the only other person in the room who knew his full professional background. She was 71 years old, 22 years the church administrator, and she carried institutional knowledge the way certain buildings carry load, quietly without exhibition, but in a way that meant everything stood because of her. She had been setting up this meeting for most of the morning. She had arranged the chairs with the particular care she brought to every arrangement enough space between rows for people to stand, without crowding the front table set for the pastor's materials, the side table with the cake and the water and the notepad she used for minutes. The Sony digital voice recorder, small gray. Unremarkable, the same device she had placed on the same shelf behind the podium before every disbursement meeting for 7 years had been running since 1138. She set it without announcement. She checked the battery indicator the way other people checked the weather. The recorder was old enough that nobody remembered when it had appeared on the shelf, only that it had always been there, that Vivian had always checked it, and pressed record, that the audio files went into the archive alongside the written minutes, and that this practice had been so consistent for so long that it had stopped being a choice and become simply the way things were done. Nobody in the room ever commented on the recorder because nobody in the room had ever needed to. It had been on that shelf so long it had become invisible. On the table beside the ledger lay the State Housing Authority grant authorization form. $47,000 allocated for emergency housing assistance for 12 of the 14 families in the room. The authorization window closed at 5 o'clock that afternoon. He intended to complete the disbursement entries and then sign the form before 3 o'clock, which would give him a comfortable margin. He was precise about margins. 14 years reading financial crimes for the federal government had made imprecision feel like a moral failing. He had built cases on the gaps between what documents said and what the numbers underneath them proved, and he had learned to close every gap himself before anyone else had a chance to misinterpret it. He was writing the amount for the third family, $1,200, the Perkins family medical debt from a hospitalization in February when the double doors at the back of the hall opened. The sound was not dramatic. It was an ordinary door sound. The click of the latch, the soft exhalation of air from a warm room into a cooler hallway. But it came at the wrong moment in the wrong weight, and something in the room shifted the way a room shifts when someone enters who is not expected and who does not apologize for arriving. The man who entered was thick-necked and 36 years old, carrying a printed arrest warrant, the way a man carries a trophy held slightly away from the body displayed. His name was Craig Fenwick. He wore a Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Office uniform that was new enough that the creases in the sleeves were still sharp. Behind him, 2 uniformed deputies moved through the doorway and spread slightly to either side, occupying the back of the room the way people occupy space when they want it to feel occupied. Fenwick had filed his tip report that morning through the non-emergency line, alleging that $40,000 of trust funds had been redirected to a personal account. The originating terminal ID printed in the tip report's header identified a workstation in the Caldwell Parish City Hall records office, but Fenwick had not looked at that line because Fenwick had not written the tip report. He had only received it and escalated it without referring it to the State Financial Crimes Unit as standard protocol required, because referral would have taken days he apparently did not have. He had never handled a financial crimes case before this one. He had handled 11 arrests in 3 years, none of them complex, and he had approached each of them the way he approached this one, as a matter of arriving with paperwork and sufficient authority. He announced himself with his badge, holding it high, scanning the rows of seated families as though measuring their fear. He said the pastor's name the way men say the names of people they believe they already have. His voice was loud in a room where people had been speaking in careful, measured tones for the better part of 2 hours. He set his eyes on the man at the front table. The man at the front table did not look up immediately. He finished the number he was writing. The amount was complete. The family name was complete. And then he set the pen beside the ledger on the table and looked up. He removed his reading glasses. He placed them on the ledger in the same motion. Unhurried emotion so practiced it had the quality of ritual. He looked at Fenwick the way a man looks at a problem he has not created but recognizes immediately. He was 6 feet and 2 inches of mahogany stillness. His silver-threaded hair was close-cropped above a face that had been carved by decades of reading what people tried to hide in numbers. The particular patience of someone who understood that the truth in any document was not always in what was written, but in the relationship between what was written and what was not. His shoulders were broad and square beneath the dark suit jacket he wore at every disbursement meeting, because these meetings were covenants, and covenants deserved a certain formality. His hands, resting flat on the table now on either side of the open ledger, were steady. He said quietly, "Officer, I would ask you to lower your voice. There are children in this room." Fenwick said, "Stand up." And the 14 families of the Cornerstone Community Trust sat very still, and the child at the end of the 3rd row stopped coloring, and the room became the kind of quiet that is not peace, but the absence of peace. Something moved behind the pastor's eyes when Fenwick said that. Not anger. He had not been truly angry in a situation like this in a long time, because anger was a way of losing control, and losing control was the one thing the other party always wanted. What moved in his eyes was recognition. The precise, unhurried assessment of a man who had spent 14 years identifying the exact moment when someone stepped over a line from which there was no return. He had seen that moment in conference rooms and courtrooms and corporate offices and the back offices of brokerage firms. He had seen it on the faces of tax attorneys who had convinced themselves that complexity would protect them. He knew what it looked like from the outside. He knew what it felt like to be standing on the safe side of that line watching someone cross it. He stood. He was taller than Fenwick had expected. He saw that in Fenwick's face, the half-second recalibration, the slight stiffening in the shoulders, the adjustment. He had seen that before, too. He had learned a long time ago that height was not power, but that some people confused them, and that the confusion was sometimes useful. His eyes were doing something Fenwick had never seen in an arrest. They were not afraid. They were calculating. Sister Vivian, from her seat at the side table where she kept her notepads and the recording log and the case files for the day's disbursements, watched all of it without moving. She had been taking notes at every trust meeting for 22 years. She knew how to watch without being seen watching. She had watched this man sit with dying deacons in hospital waiting rooms at midnight. Had watched him negotiate payment plans with families who could not afford to fail. Had watched him read the fine print on every contract anyone placed in front of him, read it completely both pages before he touched a pen to it, regardless of how long it took. She had watched him build the trust from a handwritten charter and 22 founding members into a 19-year institution that had never once required an outside audit because it had always already done the work of an audit on itself. She had never once seen his hands shake. They were not shaking now. That told her everything she needed to know about the next several hours. The ledger was open on the table. The pen lay beside it. The entries were not complete. The grant authorization form lay to the right of the ledger, unsigned, the 5 o'clock deadline, printed in small type at the bottom of the second page. He stood, and Fenwick said, "Stand up again," even though he was already standing and the room held itself very carefully together and the afternoon light continued to press through the windows as though nothing in the world had changed. Fenwick moved to the front of the room with a certainty that was in its own way a kind of courage. The courage of a man who has convinced himself that the outcome is already determined. He had 2 deputies at his back, and a warrant in his hand, and a story in his head about a community fund administrator who thought paperwork could cover his tracks. He had arrested people before. Most of them crumbled at the sight of the warrant. Most of them began explaining before he asked them to. Most of them did something with their hands or their eyes or their voice that told him exactly what he needed to know about the state they were in. This man extended his wrists. It was the gesture of someone who had watched arrests for 14 years and understood their choreography from the inside out. Someone who knew that compliance in this moment cost nothing, because the truth of the situation was not located in the booking room or the holding cell. The truth of the situation was located in a ledger on a table, and a cloud backup drive, and a 71-year-old woman who was writing something on a notepad 3 feet from the side table. Resistance served no purpose. Dignity was not surrendered by compliance. It could only be surrendered by losing control, and he had not lost control in this room in 19 years. The deputy named Garrett, who had been on the force 11 months, and who had expected something different, instinctively slowed before he put on the cuffs. Fenwick said for the room to hear, "Marcus Adeyemi, you are under arrest for theft by fiduciary, felony, maximum 10 years. He said it loudly. He said it with the full projection of someone who wanted the words to land in the room and remain there. The charge theft by fiduciary was a specific kind of allegation with specific statutory elements, and it required specific evidence, and there were people in the room who had legal training and people who did not. But the word theft was a word everyone in the room understood, and Fenwick had calculated, consciously or not, that the word landing in that room would do a particular kind of damage that was separate from the law. The room was silent for 2 full seconds. Then a woman in the second row made a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a word, and the child at the end of the 3rd row set down the paper bag and began to cry quietly, the way children cry when they know something is wrong but do not know what to call it. The pastor turned his head slowly and looked at the room. Not at Fenwick. At the room. He moved his gaze across the 14 families the way a man reads a document he has memorized methodically, row by row, face by face, seeing each person completely. A memory surfaced briefly and without warning from the first disbursement meeting 19 years ago in this same hall with 22 families and a new ledger and a charter he had written by hand. He had looked at that room and thought, these people are trusting you with something irreplaceable. He had carried that thought in the front of his mind at every meeting since. It was there now. Some of the families looked away when he met their eyes. Others held his gaze. Raymond Webb, 44 years old, who had received his eviction notice 6 days ago, and whose disbursement was written in the open ledger in the pastor's handwriting, did not look away. He pulled out his phone. As they walked him toward the door, the pastor's gaze reached Sister Vivian last. He spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear it across the distance between them, below the ambient sound of the room, below the sound of children and the shifting of chairs and the clank of the cuffs. He said, "The ledger is on the table. The entries are not complete." Vivian nodded once. She did not look at the ledger. She looked at his face the way she had looked at his face for 22 years in rooms like this, and rooms nothing like this. And she did what she had always done with what she saw in it. She remembered it, and she carried it, and she acted on it. Then he was through the door, and the hall was quiet except for the sound of the child crying and the sound of Raymond Webb's phone. Vivian sat for precisely 5 seconds after the deputies left the hall. Then she picked up her pen and wrote on the notepad in front of her. 2:47 p.m. She was writing the time. The numbers came out in her meticulous administrator's hand, the same hand that had logged 341 families, 8 ledgers, 22 years of minutes, 7 years of recording entries. She did not annotate what the time referred to. She would remember. Through the window beside the side table, she could see the hallway leading to the church office. She watched Fenwick's silhouette and his partners move down it. She watched the office door open without a knock. She kept watching. She watched Fenwick's hand reach to the shelf behind the podium in the office. She watched his fingers close around the Sony recorder, the recorder that had been on that shelf for 7 years, that she had pressed record on at 11:38 that morning, 2 hours and 49 minutes ago. She wrote on the notepad, "Recorder taken Officer Fenwick, 2:47 p.m. Then she looked at her phone. The cloud backup application had been running since 11:38. It uploaded automatically continuously the moment the recorder was within range of the church's wireless network, which it had been since the moment she set it on the shelf. The file was already on the cloud drive. All of it. Every minute from the beginning of the recording. She did not open the application. She knew what was there. She simply needed to know that it was intact. Outside in the parking lot, Fenwick walked with his partner carrying the recorder and 2 folders of financial records. He said to his partner loud enough that 2 families in the parking lot could hear open and shut, "These community fund guys always think the paperwork covers them." He was grinning. His partner laughed. Raymond Webb, standing 20 feet from them, was filming. The grant authorization form was still on the table in the hall. It was 2:55 p.m. The window closed at 5 o'clock, 2 hours and 5 minutes. Sister Vivian picked up the grant form. She held it for exactly 3 seconds, reading the deadline date, the amount, the 12 family case numbers listed as conditional recipients. Then she set it down with care and called State Representative Gloria Hines on her personal number, which Vivian had memorized because she had been calling it for 16 years. At 3:15, Fenwick's department filed for a financial hold on all 3 trust accounts at Caldwell Federal Credit Union. The hold, if uncontested, before close of business would freeze 12 active disbursements for 90 days and would trigger, under the terms of the church's grant relationship with the State Housing Authority, an automatic review of the trust's compliance status, a review that, attached to a pending felony charge, would function in practice as a suspension. Vivian was already in her car. She had the notepad. She had her phone, which was connected to a cloud drive that had been backing up audio since 11:38 that morning. She had been taking minutes for 22 years, and she understood what a record was for, and she was driving toward the person in Caldwell Parish who could move the fastest. She did not look back at the church as she pulled out of the parking lot. There was nothing behind her that needed tending. Everything that needed tending was in front of her. At the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Office booking station, the fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that made the countertop look slightly green. The room smelled of old coffee and the particular institutional staleness of spaces where people waited without wanting to. The booking officer, a woman named Presley, who had processed intakes for 11 years, and who prided herself on the efficient neutrality with which she moved people through paperwork, asked, as she always asked occupation. He answered without pausing. Senior Pastor, New Bethel, AME Church, retired G.S., 15 Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, 14 years. Presley's typing slowed. She looked up. He met her eyes without expression. His hands were resting at his sides, still the way they had been, still when the cuffs went on and still when they came off. His posture was the same it had been when he stood from the table in the church hall, not rigid, because rigidity was a kind of tension, and he was not tense. He was simply completely grounded. The particular groundedness of someone who understood that the situation was bad, and that his reaction to it would not make it better or worse because his reaction was not the relevant variable. Presley called her supervisor quietly with the practiced understatement of someone who had seen enough to know when something was different. The supervisor came over and read the form. Neither of them said anything to him after that except yes, sir, for the rest of the processing. The supervisor made one call on his desk phone that Presley could not hear. The call was short. He was placed in a holding cell and given time to think. He used it carefully. He thought about the charge theft by fiduciary felony, maximum 10 years. He had prosecuted cases under that statute for 7 of his 14 years at the federal level. He knew its elements. He knew what evidence was required to sustain it. He knew with the precision of someone who had built cases for the federal government exactly what the allegation required, documented evidence of misappropriation. A specific transfer, a specific amount, a traceable pathway from the trust's accounts to a personal account, and a timeline demonstrating that the transfer was intentional and not a ledger error. He had run the trust for 19 years. Every entry in every ledger was countersigned by 2 deacons. Every disbursement was documented with the corresponding board authorization, time-stamped and photographed and stored in a digital archive that went back to the trust's founding day. The accounts at Caldwell Federal Credit Union matched his ledger to the dollar. Because he checked them monthly. Because he had been checking them monthly since the beginning, because 14 years of reading financial crimes had made the discipline of verification as automatic as breathing. The transfer that the charge alleged had not occurred. He knew this the way he knew anything that could be proven not by feeling, but by evidence. The money was where it was supposed to be. It had always been where it was supposed to be. The allegation that $40,000 had been redirected to his personal account was not only false. It was the kind of false that a forensic accountant could dismantle in an afternoon, because money that moved left traces, and traces could not be invented without the invention itself being visible to anyone who knew where to look. He knew where to look. What concerned him was not the charge. What concerned him was the clock on the wall. The State Housing Authority grant window had closed at 5 o'clock that afternoon. He had not been there to sign the form. $47,000, 12 families in active housing crisis expired in the 90-minute window between his arrest and the deadline. Not stolen, not misappropriated, simply expired because the person who was supposed to sign the form was in a booking station being processed for a crime that had not occurred. He sat with that for a long time in the holding cell. He thought about the families. He thought about the Webb family specifically. Raymond Webb, 44, who had filmed the arrest from the parking lot and whose eviction was now 5 days away, and whose disbursement of $2,400 was written in his handwriting in a ledger that was still open on a table in the church hall. He thought about the grant authorization form on that same table, unsigned, the deadline passed now by hours. He thought, this is the damage. The charge will not survive. The charge is paper. But the grant window is real, and it is closed, and those 12 families are real, and their situations did not stop because a warrant was served. He thought about the ledger entry he had not finished. He thought about the pen he had set down on the table. He thought about finishing it. A memory came, then quiet and precise. 19 years ago, the night he had sat down alone to write the trust's founding charter at a kitchen table in the house on Meridian Street, a yellow legal pad in front of him and a glass of water he had not touched. He had written the word covenant and then sat with it for 10 minutes before continuing, making sure it was the right word, making sure it meant what he needed it to mean, making sure everyone who came after would understand that this was not a transaction, that this was not charity with forms attached, that this was something a community built for itself from the principle that the floor they made together was more important than any individual ladder. He had kept the original charter in the fire-safe box alongside the ledgers. He had read it once a year in January before the first meeting of the new year to remind himself why the precision mattered, why the counter-signatures mattered, why the timestamps mattered, why every number in every ledger had to be exactly correct. He held the memory and waited. Back at the department, Fenwick was at his desk. He connected the Sony recorder to a computer and played 6 minutes of audio from the middle of the disbursement meeting, the section where the pastor read disbursement amounts into the record and families acknowledged receipt. It was in every surface sense exactly what it appeared to be a well-run fiduciary meeting, documented with transparency, every amount stated aloud and countersigned. Fenwick played it for his lieutenant and said, "They think the meeting audio covers them, but the transfers happened outside the meeting." His lieutenant listened and said nothing. Fenwick logged the recorder as evidence item number 4 and put it in a locked drawer. He had not listened to the beginning of the file. He did not know that the recording began at 11:38 in the morning. He did not know that the recorder had been running when he entered the church office alone at 12:49, before his partner arrived, before the arrests began to make a call on his personal phone. The recorder had been 6 feet from him on the shelf. He had not seen it. It had been on that shelf for 7 years, and it had become exactly as invisible as the shelf itself. At 4:42 p.m., State Representative Gloria Hines called the State Attorney General's office on a direct line. She had the cloud backup audio shared from Vivian's phone transferred to a secure folder and already partially reviewed. She had the notepad with the timestamps in Vivian's hand. 2:47 p.m. recorder taken Officer Fenwick. 2:47 p.m. time noted, each written in the calm, legible script of a woman who had been recording facts in this manner for 22 years. She had a copy of the original tip report, which she had pulled from the public records portal within 20 minutes of Vivian arriving at her office, and which contained in its header data the originating terminal ID, a workstation assigned to a specific office in the Caldwell Parish City Hall Records Division. She read that terminal ID to the AG's office representative and said, "I need someone to tell me whose desk that is." At 5 o'clock, the grant window closed. Vivian documented this with a timestamp on her notepad. Raymond Webb's phone video had 8,000 views by 7 o'clock that evening. James Collier of the Caldwell Herald had called the church office twice. The Webb family's eviction was now 5 days away. Their disbursement was frozen. The entry in the ledger that bore their name and their amount was incomplete. 18 hours after the arrest, Marcus Adeyemi walked out of the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Office on bond. The morning air was cool and carried the smell of cut grass and distant rain, and the specific quality of air that has not been filtered through concrete and fluorescent light. He stood on the steps for a moment without moving, not from hesitation, but from the deliberate practice he had cultivated over 50 years of understanding that a man who rushes from one place to the next without pausing to assess the changed landscape between them makes errors he cannot afford. The church had retained Keisha Odom. She had handled 2 prior civil rights cases in the state, and her record in federal court was the kind of record that made opposing counsel read the file twice before the first meeting. She had already filed an emergency motion to lift the financial hold on the trust accounts before Adeyemi was released. Her argument was 6 pages and cited 4 precedents. The accounts were registered. Fiduciary instruments under state law, not personal assets, and the hold filed under a statute designed for personal asset freezes was categorically improper. A judge granted the temporary lift within 6 hours of the filing. That afternoon, Vivian placed everything on the conference room table, one item at a time. The cloud backup drive. 7 years of recording logs, each page time-stamped with meeting date, recording start time, file name, and cloud backup confirmation code. The notepad from the day of the arrest, the 2 handwritten entries unchanged. A printed copy of the upload history from the cloud drive showing automatic continuous backup from 11:38 that morning. She explained the recording practice from the beginning. She had started it 7 years ago after a trust meeting where a family disputed the recorded amount of their disbursement. A misunderstanding, not a fraud, but Vivian had decided that the audio record would make such disputes impossible in the future. She had maintained the practice without variation since. Every disbursement meeting, every general meeting, every extraordinary meeting. She started the recorder before she did anything else when she arrived. She checked the battery indicator before she set it on the shelf. The backup ran automatically. She had never needed to invoke it before now. Odom listened without interrupting. When Vivian finished, Odom was quiet for a full moment. The conference room held the same stillness that certain rooms acquire when information of a particular weight has just settled into them. Outside the window, a church maintenance worker was trimming the hedge along the parking lot's edge, the sound of shears rhythmic and distant, cutting through the quiet at intervals. The ordinary world continuing without adjustment. Then Odom said, "The recording that Fenwick seized evidence item number 4 covers the period before the meeting started." Vivian said yes, Odom said. "And the backup drive contains the same audio," Vivian said. "Everything on the recorder uploads immediately, the moment it was within range of the wireless network." Odom wrote something on her legal pad. The pen moved quickly and then stopped. Then she looked up and said, "What does the recording contain from before the meeting began?" Vivian looked at her hands for a moment. She had a memory brief, clear, and specific of pressing play on the cloud drive audio the previous evening alone in the church office after everyone had left. Listening through the ambient sound of the hall being set up, through the sound of the ventilation system, through the distant murmur of voices from the hallway. And then the office door opening at 12:49. Footsteps. Movement. A phone being dialed. She said, "There is 11 minutes of audio from the office." 1 person entered. There was movement around the space. Then a phone call. The person making the call was not aware the recorder was running. She paused. She said, "The person said the tip went through, it's filed, we moved today. He won't be able to contest it before the grant window closes." And then that person laughed. Odom set her pen down, completely flat on the table. She did not pick it up again for a long moment. The AG's office had been working through the night on the terminal ID from the tip report. The workstation was assigned to a man named Dennis Farrow, Deputy City Clerk of Caldwell Parish, a position he had held for 9 years. Farrow had a documented professional relationship with a property development company that had been attempting to acquire the parking lot adjacent to New Bethel AME Church for 2 years. The acquisition required a zoning reclassification that depended on the church's property status, and the church had declined every offer without negotiation. Phone records subpoenaed that morning showed 2 calls between Farrow's desk phone and Fenwick's personal cell in the 24 hours before the tip was filed. 1 call between Fenwick's personal cell and an unidentified number placed 8 minutes after the tip was logged in the non-emergency system. The unidentified number resolved within 4 hours of subpoena to Farrow's personal cell. Odom filed for discovery on all evidence items seized by Fenwick's department. The department's evidence log showed at item number 4, Sony digital voice recorder black. Seized New Bethel AME Church, 2:47 p.m., Officer C. Fenwick. She submitted a formal request for immediate production of the device for discovery proceedings. Fenwick's lieutenant responded 6 hours later. He did not produce the recorder. He said it needed to be reviewed by departmental counsel first. Odom noted his response, its delay, and its reasoning in a formal letter, and filed all three with the court the same afternoon. That evening in the church hall, Adeyemi sat at the table where the meeting had been interrupted 36 hours before. The hall was empty. The afternoon light had become evening light coming through the windows at a lower angle, catching the edges of the folding tables. The ledger was in front of him, open to the interrupted entry. He had brought the pen from his shirt pocket. He worked through the afternoon and into the evening in silence. He completed each interrupted entry. 12 families, 12 amounts, 12 purposes stated in the margin beside the dollar figure. He wrote with the same hand he always wrote, with the same deliberateness, the same pressure on the pen. He did not rush. He had learned in 14 years of federal work that rushing through a ledger created errors, and that errors in a ledger were not merely accounting problems. They were evidence of something, and evidence of anything in a ledger that was currently under scrutiny became a problem of a different kind. He completed 11 of the 12 entries. The 12th. The Webb family's entry. The one he had been writing when Fenwick came through the door, he did not complete. He wrote the family name, he wrote the amount, he wrote the date and the disbursement purpose. But he left the signature line blank, and he left the counter-signature space blank, and he closed the ledger with the pen placed on the cover. He had decided, without announcing the decision, that this entry would be finished once, and it would be finished correctly, and it would be finished with Raymond Webb's pen in Raymond Webb's hand. He drove home and ate dinner and went to sleep at 10 o'clock. The Sony recorder was in a locked evidence drawer in the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Office. Odom had filed for it, and nobody in that department had listened past the first 6 minutes of a recording that had begun at 11:38 that morning, 1 hour and 11 minutes before Officer Craig Fenwick had entered the church office alone to make a phone call. The hearing room at the Caldwell Parish Courthouse was smaller than the church hall, and colder, and smelled of coffee and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where difficult things were said and documented and filed. The fluorescent lights in the ceiling were slightly different temperatures, one cooler, one warmer, and the visual dissonance of that had been bothering the court reporter for 3 years without anyone fixing it. Long tables, institutional chairs, a side table with a water pitcher that nobody had touched. Adeyemi sat at the left table. His suit jacket was dark gray and precisely pressed. His hands were flat on the surface in front of him, in the same position they had been in when Fenwick first saw them across the church hall. Odom sat beside him with a folder and a tablet and the particular stillness of a trial attorney who knows what is in the next file and has already decided how to play it. Across the aisle, Fenwick sat with his department legal representative, a municipal defense attorney named Pruitt, who had been doing this work for 17 years. Pruitt's expression was carefully neutral in the way that experienced lawyers make their expressions neutral when they have received information close to the hearing date that they are not fully sure how to process. He had his own folder open in front of him, but had not looked at it in 12 minutes. At the far end of the table, D.A. Patricia Morrow sat with the tip report and the financial hold documentation and a legal pad she had already covered in annotations. Corinne Vasquez from the State Attorney General's office sat beside Morrow. At the back of the room, Dr. Adrienne Walsh, a federal civil rights observer who had arrived in Caldwell Parish the previous afternoon after the terminal ID surfaced in the AG's investigation, sat with a yellow legal pad and a closed folder watching. Fenwick entered the room with his folder against his chest. He had reviewed the financial records 3 times in the preceding 48 hours. He believed with the particular certainty of someone who has committed fully to a course of action and has trained himself not to look for the door that the financial documentation supported the charge. He had not reviewed evidence item number 4 since the day he filed it in the evidence drawer. He had not listened to the beginning of the recording. He did not know that he should. Odom began with the cloud backup audio. She played 22 minutes of the disbursement meeting, the complete record from the call to order through every disbursement announcement, every family acknowledgement, every counter-signature called aloud by name and amount and date. Adeyemi's voice reading each purpose before signing. The family's voices clear and distinct, acknowledging receipt. The sound of the pen on the ledger. 2 deacons confirming counter-signatures. 22 minutes of a fiduciary process conducted with a transparency that was not performed but structural, built into the process itself by a man who had designed it from the beginning to be unassailable. When it finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Morrow was looking at her notes. Vasquez was writing. Dr. Walsh had written one line on her legal pad. Fenwick said the recording proved nothing. He said the alleged misappropriation occurred in transfers outside the meeting in the period between disbursement sessions. He said it with the firmness of a man who has rehearsed the line. He was still composed. He believed he was managing the room. Odom said, "I'm requesting that evidence item number 4. The Sony digital voice recorder seized from New Bethel AME Church by Officer Fenwick at 2:47 p.m. on the day of the arrest be played in its entirety, from the beginning of the recording, not from a selected timestamp." Pruitt objected to the basis of the request. Morrow said, "I'm overruling the objection. The device was logged as evidence in this proceeding and is subject to full discovery production." A deputy brought the recorder from the evidence locker. It was placed on the table and connected to the room's audio output. The device was small and gray and unremarkable, the kind of object that could sit on a shelf for 7 years without anyone remarking on it. The deputy pressed play. The recording began at 11:38 in the morning. For the first 51 minutes, the audio captured the ambient sounds of a church preparing for a meeting. The ventilation system, distant voices from the hall, chairs being arranged, Vivian moving through the space, the sound of the cake being set on the side table, the sound of the side door opening and closing as families arrived and found their seats, the murmur of conversations low and patient in the hall. And then at 12:49 and 32 seconds, the office door opened. Footsteps. The sound of someone moving through the office space, not quickly, not carefully. The movement of someone who believed they were alone and unhurried. The sound of something being moved on a desk. A pause. The sound of a phone call being placed, the tone sequence of a number being dialed on a cell phone, captured clearly by the Sony recorder 6 feet away on the shelf, the tertia, and then a voice. Clear, close, unmistakable in its confidence. The voice said, "The tip went through. It's filed. We moved today. He won't be able to contest it before the grant window closes." A pause. Then a short, satisfied laugh, the laugh of a man who believes the outcome is already written. The recording continued, capturing the last 20 minutes before Fenwick's official arrival at the church, and then the meeting itself, and then at 2:31 p.m. the sound of the doors opening and the proceedings that followed. The room did not move. Fenwick's color left his face all at once without gradation, the way color leaves a room when a light is switched off. Not slowly, not by degrees, simply gone. His hands, which had been resting on the table in a deliberate imitation of composure, moved to the edge and wrapped around it. His fingers whitened. D.A. Morrow removed her glasses and set them on the table with a care that was different from the care with which she usually set things on tables. She looked at the audio player. She looked at her legal pad. She looked at Vasquez. Dr. Walsh opened her folder for the first time in the hearing. She wrote something more than one line. Then she reached for her phone and began composing a message. Pruitt turned and looked at Fenwick. He said nothing. The silence between them was not the silence of consultation. It was the silence of a man who is recalculating a situation he understands has fundamentally changed. Odom did not look at Fenwick. She looked at the judge steadily, with the unhurried patience of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and has now arrived at it. She said, "The recording that Officer Fenwick seized as evidence item number 4 and logged as evidence supporting the prosecution's financial claims, contains Officer Fenwick's own voice captured at 12:49 p.m. on the day of the arrest, 1 hour and 42 minutes before his documented official arrival, confirming that the tip filing was coordinated, that the timing of the arrest was intentional, and that the explicit purpose was to ensure that Pastor Adeyemi could not contest the resulting financial hold before the State Housing Authority grant window expired. The cloud backup of this same recording confirms the file's integrity and establishes an unbroken chain of custody from the moment of recording. She paused for exactly 1 beat. She said Officer Fenwick seized the evidence that documents his own conduct, and in seizing it he placed it into the formal discovery record. Adeyemi had not moved in his chair throughout any of this. His hands were flat on the table. His face showed nothing. Not relief, not vindication, not anger. The former IRS Criminal Investigation Division auditor had been building this structure in his head since the booking station had felt from the moment he read the charge and recognized the kind of false. It was the shape of what must exist underneath it. A false of this specific kind, one that required a grant window, a coordinated timeline. A tip filed through a non-standard channel without the required referral did not arise spontaneously. It was designed, and things that were designed left evidence of their design because design required coordination, and coordination left traces in the record, and the record was his territory. He had not known the tape would contain exactly this. He had known the tape would contain something. He had waited with the patience of someone who understood that the evidence would arrive when it arrived, and that his role until then was to stay still and not impede it. A memory came to him, seated in that cold courtroom, clear and brief, a case from his 9th year at the IRS. A man who had built an elaborate offshore structure to conceal income, who had been so confident in the structure's complexity that he had made one small casual call on a recorded government line to confirm one detail, and that call had been the thread the team had pulled to unravel everything. The man had not been careless. He had simply believed he was invisible in a moment when he was not. He had believed the room was empty. The lesson was not about cleverness. The lesson was about what a person reveals when they stop believing anyone is watching. Vivian had been watching. She had been watching for 7 years from the same shelf with the same recorder, and nobody had ever thought to look. Vasquez stood and formally requested a recess. When the hearing resumed 22 minutes later, she announced that the investigation into the originating terminal had concluded. Dennis Farrow, Deputy City Clerk of Caldwell Parish, had entered a proffer agreement that morning implicating Officer Craig Fenwick in a coordinated scheme to fabricate a financial crimes report. The proffer named the property developer as the originating interest. The scheme's stated purpose per the proffer was to trigger a felony charge against the trust's administrator sufficient to freeze the trust's assets and suspend its grant relationships with the goal of forcing a sale of the adjacent parking lot. The grant window timing had not been incidental. The grant window had been the mechanism. Dr. Walsh was still on her phone. The call was long. Fenwick was still in the room. His badge was still on his belt. But something was ending, and everyone in the room could feel the specific quality of that ending. The kind that did not leave room for reversal, because the record now contained what it contained, and the record was permanent. He thought about the ledger. He thought about the incomplete entry. He thought, I will finish it. And the thought was not hope. It was simply a fact he was holding on to steady and certain, while everything around it moved. Federal charges were filed within hours of the hearing's conclusion. 18 United States Code Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law and conspiracy to commit civil rights violations. The charges carried a maximum of 10 years each. Farrow was charged separately under a related conspiracy count. The property developer whose acquisition attempt had generated the original scheme came under investigation by both the State Commerce Authority, and within 48 hours a federal grand jury convened in the state capitol. All charges against Marcus Adeyemi were dismissed with prejudice the same afternoon. Not deferred, not conditionally suspended. Dismissed with prejudice permanently, the formal legal equivalent of the record stating that the charges should never have existed. Autumn filed simultaneously for all court costs, filing fees, legal fees, and associated expenses to be assessed against the department. The court granted the motion within 48 hours. State Representative Gloria Hines worked the phone through the evening. At 7:37 p.m., she reached the director of the State Housing Authority on his personal line. By 8:54 p.m., she had a verbal commitment for an emergency reauthorization of the lapsed grant. The formal paperwork arrived the following morning with a letter from the Housing Authority acknowledging the circumstances of the lapse and the role of the department's financial hold in causing it. The 12 families received their disbursements within 72 hours. The Webb family's eviction was formally stayed the same day the funds cleared. Raymond Webb filmed himself receiving the stay paperwork at the county clerk's office. The video had 42,000 views by the following morning. Officer Craig Fenwick was suspended without pay effective the afternoon of the hearing. He was indicted 18 days later on the federal charges. His department's Internal Affairs Division opened a review of 3 prior arrests in Fenwick's record that exhibited patterns similar to the case against Adeyemi, a review that a community advocacy organization had requested 14 months earlier and that had been denied at the time. It was no longer denied. Pruitt Fenwick's municipal defense attorney withdrew from the case on the 5th day, citing a conflict of interest he declined to specify publicly. Fenwick's wife's family released a statement on the 7th day. 3 sentences. They were cooperating with all relevant investigations. They had not been aware of the nature of the activities described in the charges. They had no further comment. He was alone in the specific way that a man is alone when every structure he depended on removes itself simultaneously. Not the aloneness of lost friendship, but the aloneness of someone who discovers that what he believed was his ground was borrowed, and the loan has been called. Dennis Farrow's proffer formalized into a plea agreement 9 days after the indictment named 2 additional city officials who had known about the fabricated tip and taken no action. Both resigned within the week. The property developer's zoning reclassification request was withdrawn by council the same day the developer came under investigation and the acquisition attempt. It was intended to enable collapse without a mechanism to sustain it. The parking lot adjacent to New Bethel AME Church remained where it had always been church property without encumbrance. James Collier of the Caldwell Herald ran the story over 4 consecutive days, each installment expanding the picture, the trust's history, the families affected the grant window, the recorder, Vivian's cloud backup, the terminal ID Farrow's plea. By the 3rd day, it had been picked up by the state wire services. By the 4th, it was in national financial press, which was interested in the specific, almost architectural irony of a 14-year IRS criminal investigation division. Auditor being charged with financial fraud and cleared in the same week, using evidence the charging officer himself had seized, logged, and placed into the discovery record. Raymond Webb's video from the day of the arrest reached 140,000 views and was referenced in 3 of the Caldwell Herald's 4 installments. 9 days after the arrest, Marcus Adeyemi walked back through the double doors of New Bethel AME Church. The same hall, the same afternoon light in the same long columns through the same windows, the same suspended dust catching the same gold, the same folding tables arranged in the same configuration. 14 families in the same rows, not the same seats exactly, but the same families returned. Sister Vivian arrived before anyone else, as she had arrived before anyone else for 22 years. She moved through the preparations without hurry or ceremony, doing each thing in the order she always did them. She set up the side table. She checked that the water pitcher was filled. She put the cake on the side table. Lemon pound cake, same recipe, same pan. She retrieved the Sony recorder from the evidence locker where it had been returned with a formal receipt and a written apology from the department. She checked the battery indicator. She set it on the shelf behind the podium. She pressed record at 11:38. She sat down at the side table, opened her notepad, and wrote the meeting number at the top of the page, meeting number 147. When the families were seated, and the hall had reached the warm, settled quiet that always preceded the call to order, Adeyemi opened the ledger to the entry he had left incomplete. He found the page without searching. He knew which page it was, had known for 9 days. He read the date he had written there, which was 9 days ago. He read the family name Webb. He read the amount $2,400. He read what he had written of the disbursement purpose. He picked up the pen. He wrote the final figures he had left blank. He wrote them carefully with the same hand and the same deliberateness as always, as though this entry were no different from any of the 843 entries in this ledger and the 7 ledgers before it, because it was not different. It was the same covenant completed. Then he held the pen out across the table to Raymond Webb. Raymond Webb was 44 years old and had an eviction stay in his pocket, and 140,000 people who had watched the video he filmed in a parking lot 9 days ago. He sat in the same metal folding chair he had sat in then. He looked at the pen for a moment, the way a person looks at something they understand the weight of without being able to articulate the weight. He thought about the parking lot and the afternoon and the sound of the cuffs and the way the pastor had looked at each of them in turn as they walked him out, not asking for anything, not performing anything, simply seeing each person clearly. He took the pen. He held it for a moment. The pen was ordinary, a ballpoint, the same kind Adeyemi had always used for the ledger, inexpensive, reliable, the kind that lasted 2 months with daily use and was replaced without ceremony. Webb had not expected to feel anything about holding it. He felt something anyway. He felt the weight of what the pen was being asked to record, not just the entry in the ledger before him, but the 9 days behind the entry, and the 19 years behind the 9 days, and the 341 families whose names were in the previous 7 ledgers, in the fire safe box, in the church office, each of whom had held a version of this pen and pressed it to a page, and been seen and been counted and been kept. He thought about the parking lot. He thought about what it had meant to press record on his phone that day, not as strategy, not as protest, simply because something true was happening and it seemed important that the truth have a witness. Vivian had understood the same thing for 7 years running. She had pressed record on a shelf every meeting for 7 years, not because she was waiting for something to happen, but because she understood that truth needed to be preserved before you knew you would need it. Then he pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name in the countersignature space of the ledger beside the date, beside the amount, beside the family name that had always been his family's name. Adeyemi looked at the signature. He nodded once, the same nod he gave at every countersigning, the acknowledgement that was not gratitude and not authority, but simply the recognition that one person had trusted another with something irreplaceable and that the trust had been kept. The covenant intact. He moved through the remaining 13 families the same way he had moved through them for 19 years. Each name, each amount, each purpose read aloud before the pen moved. Each signature passed with both hands and received with both hands. Each nod at the end, the same nod 13 more times. When the last entry was done, and the last family had signed and the ledger was closed for the 147th time, Adeyemi removed his reading glasses and set them on the cover. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the ledger and looked at the room. 14 families, the afternoon light, the side table with the water and the cake, the shelf behind the podium. After the meeting ended and the hall cleared, Sister Vivian retrieved the recorder from the shelf and connected it to her laptop at the side table. She uploaded the backup file in the same motion she had used for 7 years. The same click, the same progress bar, the same confirmation that appeared when the upload completed. She opened the recording log. She wrote the date. She wrote meeting number 147. All entries complete. She wrote the recording start time 11:38. She wrote the cloud backup confirmation code. She closed the log and put it back on the shelf. She turned off the side table lamp. She picked up her notepad and her pen and her bag. She walked through the hall toward the exit, and she did not look back because there was nothing unfinished behind her. Everything had been attended to. The record was complete. If you have stayed with this story until now, you know something that most people do not bother to learn, that the structures which protect ordinary people from being destroyed are almost never dramatic. They are the recorder placed on the shelf before every meeting for 7 years. They are the timestamp written on a notepad without knowing yet why. They are the backup that runs automatically without announcement while the person responsible for it drives across town to find someone who can move quickly enough. Subscribe to this channel if you believe these stories belong in the record. Share this video with someone who needs to see that ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary consistency are the reason justice sometimes arrives at all. Leave a comment below and tell me which moment stayed with you. A ledger is not merely a record of transactions, in the right hands, in the right room, kept by the right community. It is proof that trust was honored, that ordinary people chose each other again and again across 19 years and 341 families, and every crisis that arrived without warning. No warrant can confiscate that. No false charge can revise it. No arrest can interrupt it permanently. The ink is dry. The covenant holds.